Oakwood and surrounding Venice was a battleground. At least 70 people shot.
Welcome to Boyz in the Hood TV. Today we're tapping into the streets of LA, and we're gonna be talking about Venice 13 versus the Culver City Boyz and the Venice Shoreline Crips. Now, Venice 13, aka V13, is a Mexican-American street gang based around in the Oakwood neighborhood of Venice, Los Angeles, an area historically known as Ghost Town. Now, Venice 13 started back in the 1950s, and by the 1970s, Venice 13 became one of the most feared and most dangerous street gangs in the Oakwood area. Now, one of Venice 13's biggest rivals since the 50s was another Latino gang known as Culver City, aka Culver City 13, a gang that operates from the Mar Vista Garden Projects in Culver City. The Venice 13 hate with the Culver City Boyz was so deep that anybody associated with the Culver City Boyz would become a target, and that included its own members. In 1976, a well-known Venice 13 member by the name of Paco had been warned by his own clica to stop hanging out with his cousin, who was a known Culver City gang member. Paco ignored this warning and continued to kick it with his cousin. But not long after this, while out fishing at the Venice Pier, Paco was nearly beaten to death by members of Venice 13 for disobeying their warning. He was beaten with tire irons and baseball bats. And after this beating, he was hospitalized in intensive care for over a month. But once he healed up, Paco still faced issues with the Venice 13 gang members, and that included having his vehicle firebombed by his own homeboys. About a year later, in 1977, a beef with another rival Latino gang called Lennox, aka Lennox 13. In May of 1977, Venice 13 members attended a party in the Lennox area when girls who came with the Venice 13 homeboys went to a nearby store. And in that store were members of Lennox 13. And these members started to harass the girls from Venice 13. So in return, the Venice 13 members decided to go into the Lennox hood and do a drive-by shooting on a group of members while they were sitting in the car. Now, shockingly, nobody was hurt in this incident, but not long after this, Lennox 13 would retaliate. They would head deep into the Venice hood area and do a drive-by shooting on one of the Venice 13 members' home. Now, there were no reports of anybody being killed in this incident, but this type of tit-for-tat shooting became a regular occurrence in Venice between these rival gangs. A year after this, on August 29th, 1978, at around 2 a.m. in the morning, in the Venice 13 hood, John Gonzalez and Danny Romero were taking out the trash after having a party when members of Culver City rolled by and started shooting. They let off 6 shots, critically wounding both Gonzalez and Romero. But before driving away, one of the men screamed out the window, "Keep out of Culver City." Both men would miraculously survive their wounds. But police believe that these things were heated up due to the film of a movie called Gang, aka Walk Proud, a movie which was being filmed in Culver City, which had a lot of extras, which included gang members from both Culver City and Venice 13. Now, allegedly, members of Venice 13 rented out a limo and drove through the hoods of Culver City, which pissed Culver City gang members off. But detectives from the crash unit had a different point of view and believed things went beyond just a limo driving situation. But that same year, Venice would see a rise in racial tension between blacks and Hispanics. 4 black men will be shot and killed by Venice 13 gang members. These shootings are due to a nearby gang called Venice Shoreline Crips, who is also in the Oakwood area, and their hood sits directly neck and neck with Venice 13, bordering California Avenue and Palms Boulevard. Now, as Venice 13 was warring with the Shoreline Crips, the beef with Culver City was still very much alive. And in December of 1979, Venice 13 would take a major loss. Joel Rubio, aka Japo, of Venice 13 was gunned down by Culver City 13 just right before his 18th birthday. Rubio allegedly told his homies that he wanted to have a big birthday because it would be his last. And he stated, "I won't be here," in 1980. It is said that Rubio was very active in the streets and had recently participated in a shooting which involved the Culver City gang. Now, as we head into the 80s, the gang violence only intensified on all sides, especially in the summer of 1980. From July 11th to July 27th, there will be multiple drive-bys, stabbings between Venice 13 and the Culver City 13. Now, 3 years later, on July 12, 1983, a 15-year-old by the name of Robert Rodriguez, who was affiliated with Venice 13, will be shot and killed by members of Culver City. 3 Culver City members, which included David Hernandez, will be arrested for the murder of Rodriguez, but they will ultimately be released. And this would piss off Rodriguez's uncle, who was a known Venice 13 member by the name of Gilbert Rodriguez. And on February 11, 1984, Gilbert Rodriguez would drive into the Culver City Boys territory, armed with a rifle and a shotgun. Gilbert hopped out the car and approached 2 Culver City members by the name of Manuel Sanchez and Anthony Crespin, and he opened fire on both men. They somehow managed to get away unscathed. But Rodriguez was not done yet. He would get back into his Pinto and drive a little bit further up and park in the middle of the street and hop out once again, where he would confront another group of Culver City gang members gathered outside an apartment building, which included David Hernandez, the same man who was accused of killing his nephew. As Gilbert approached the group, he yelled out, "Keep out of Chucos," and then he opened fire with a shotgun and then yelled, "This is what you motherfuckers get." Hernandez was hit twice at close range with 1 shot to the head. Other Culver City members that were hit was Rogelio Rodriguez and Javier Huerta, who were both shot but managed to survive. Gilbert fled but was later captured by police within days. Eyewitnesses from the scenes would identify him as the shooter. David Hernandez would die 3 days later in the hospital, and Huerta and Rogelio would recover from their wounds. Ultimately, Gilbert Rodriguez was convicted of first-degree murder and multiple counts of attempted murder, and he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Now, by the 90s, we would see racial tensions between Hispanic gangs and black gangs at an all-time high.
Oakwood and surrounding Venice was a battleground. Since last September, at least 70 people shot, 20 killed. A drug dispute between the Latino V13s and the Black Shoreline Crips escalated into a race war. Most of the victims weren't even gang members.
It didn't make no sense. I don't see why they had to do all that over nothing.
Neither did LAPD, which beefed up patrols all over Venice. The district attorney's office was about to implement an abatement program to clear the streets of gang members.
But the 2 rival gangs were not communicating with each other.
Innocent victims on both sides, both black and Latinos, were caught in the middle of this war. And in 1993, a man by the name of Jeremy LaShawn, who was not a gang member, but was a worker at the hospital as an orderly, was just leaving work when Venice 13 members approached him and shot and killed him because they assumed he was from Shoreline Crips. Also that same year, a 90-year-old man named Braulio Rodriguez, who was not a gang member, was gunned down by the Shoreline Crips, who assumed he was a member of Venice 13. Now, months later, in December of 1993, a Shoreline Crip affiliate, Diana Calhoun, got into an argument with Mark Herrera, a known Venice 13 member, over who would take the first hit of a crack pipe, which they were sharing. This ultimately led to Calhoun stabbing Herrera multiple times. She was later arrested and found not guilty, proving self-defense. But this would not sit well with the Venice 13 members. And just 2 weeks later, Calhoun was shot and killed by Venice 13 members. Now, the violence continued to rip through the streets of Venice all the way through the 90s. And on August 17, 1997, 2 members of Venice 13 will be shot and killed on the same night. First, at around 6:20 a.m. in the morning, Venice 13 member by the name of Peter Rangel, who had just been released from prison, stood on the corner of 6th Avenue and Broadway when suddenly a green car pulled up and opened fire. He was hit multiple times and he would die at the scene. Later that evening, at around 6 p.m., Venice 13 member Hernandez was working on a friend's car on the 600 block of 6th Avenue when a red car pulled up and started shooting. Hernandez was hit multiple times, killing him at the scene. Now, no one was ever arrested for either of these cases, but the simple fact is that Venice 13 had a ton of enemies, which included the Shoreline Crips, Santa Monica 13, Culver City Boys, and many other rivals. So this shooting could have been done by anybody. But that following year, on July 13, 1998, at around 8 p.m., Alfredo Del Mora, a Venice 13 affiliate, was driving on Venice Boulevard and Walnut Avenue when members of Culver City rode up next to him and started shooting. Alfredo was hit multiple times in his upper torso, and he was immediately rushed to UCLA Medical Center, where he would be pronounced dead. Now, this violent gang war involving Venice 13 members also spilled into the 2000s. Just 3 years later, on November 11, 2001, a known Culver City member by the name of John Lovejoy was gunned down in the early morning, and the Culver City Boyz will go on a rampage just hours later. Just a block away, a Santa Monica 13 gang member will be shot and killed. Then another man named Daniel Lal was shot, who was mistaken for a gang member. But Daniel would ultimately survive his injuries, but he would be paralyzed. Now, hours later, at around 1:30 p.m., Venice 13 member by the name of Andrew Gonzalez was walking through Venice 13 area when a car full of Culver City members rolled up and opened fire. Gonzalez somehow would survive this shooting. But later that day, at around 8:40 p.m., another man by the name of Carlos Gonzalez was walking on 6th and Broadway when a black Honda Civic, including Soph and Pac of Culver City, rolled up. Pac sat on the passenger side window and started shooting. Carlos was hit multiple times as he collapsed on the ground. He attempted to get up and drag his body on the pavement, but was unable to. Eventually, Carlos Gonzalez would die from his wounds. Pac would ultimately be arrested just some hours later, around 1 a.m., as he was spotted driving near the crime scene. Pac would be identified and convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to 62 years to life in prison. And as I always say in my videos, when there's a war, there's always casualties of war. But most of the time, the innocents are the casualties. And on August 15, 2004, Victor Rodriguez, Jose Acosta, and Juan Cortez were riding in a blue Chevy Camaro on Venice Way and Main Street when suddenly a red Mercedes full of Culver City members, which included Leo Reyes and Sergio Gines. As the Culver City members pulled up next to the blue Camaro, Sergio asked, "Where you from, S.A.?" But nobody in the car were gang members. And before anybody could answer, Sergio put out a gun and started shooting. He fired 15 shots into the Camaro, hitting Cortez, Rodriguez, and Acosta. Both Rodriguez and Acosta were critically wounded as they were holding on for dear life in the front and passenger seat. Cortez, who sat in the back, was hit, but he was not critically wounded. Moments later, police would arrive as the Culver City members fled the scene. Acosta and Rodriguez would both die from their wounds, and Cortez would survive. Now, as the Culver City members were fleeing, 2 police officers nearby heard the description of the red Mercedes and spotted them heading on the 405 freeway, and eventually tracked them down and arrested them. Cortez would identify both Leo Reyes and Sergio Gines. During their trial, Reyes and Sergio will be found guilty of murder and attempted murder and be sentenced to life in prison. Now, Venice 13, as I stated, had a lot of beef in the street. And as I touched on a little bit, they had issues with Santa Monica 13. And on Friday, September 25th of 2009, Santa Monica High School played against the Venice High School in a football game. And in attendance during the game were members of Santa Monica 13, which were Jerome Diaz and Ken Jones. And also in attendance were Venice 13 members. As the game was ending, a 17-year-old Venice 13 gang member was stabbed multiple times by Diaz and Jones. And ultimately, Jones and Diaz were arrested for stabbing of the Venice 13 member. Only days later, on September 30th, Venice 13 members Douglas Cortez, a.k.a. Little Stomper, and Salvador Cruz, a.k.a. Wormy, made their way into the Santa Monica 13 hood. They spotted a Santa Monica member by the name of Lopez riding his bike. They put up next to Lopez on his bike, and Cortez would hop out of the passenger side of the truck and immediately open fire on Lopez. As Lopez attempted to flee from the Venice 13 members, he was struck with a bullet through his leg. Also standing nearby doing yard work was Jose Soto, who was also hit by gunfire and struck in his leg also. But both Soto and Lopez would survive their wounds, and not long after this incident, Cortez and Cruz were both arrested for the shooting after witnesses described the vehicle. Eventually, they both would be convicted and sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. Years later, on January 28, 2016, known Venice 13 member by the name of Mark Gonzalez was arguing with his girlfriend, Lori Martinez. They were both walking down Sunset Boulevard and Flower Avenue when suddenly an SUV pulled up with members from Culver City inside, including Edron Villanueva, a.k.a. Goofy. Villanueva would yell Culver City and started shooting at Gonzalez. Mark Gonzalez was hit multiple times as he collapsed on the ground. with one fatal shot to the back of his head. The Culver City members would flee the scene, heading southbound. When paramedics arrived, Mark Gonzalez was pronounced dead at the scene. Not long after this incident, members within Culver City would tell police that Villanueva was the shooter, and he eventually would be arrested for the murder of Mark Gonzalez. But while in jail, Villanueva would ultimately admit to an informant in a cell that he was responsible for the murder of Gonzalez. And by the end of his trial, he was found guilty and sentenced to 50 years to life in prison. I want to thank everybody for tapping in, and I'll see y'all next time.